Hello and welcome to another episode of Agency Leadership Live. I'm your host, Chip Griffin, and it is Friday, August 21st, 2020, or March 236th, 2020, however you prefer to think of it. Either way, we've come to the end of another week. I hope it has been productive and enjoyable for you, and I hope you're looking forward to the weekend. But before we get to the weekend, of course, we have our live Q&A session, which we do every Friday, or I do here every Friday. We, this royal we. Every Friday, right here, noon Eastern Time, I answer your questions about the business of PR and marketing agencies. So let's go ahead and get into the show. So we had that zippy little introduction, and I'm looking here at the monitors, and it appears that my audio is actually on today, as opposed to a Wednesday's live show where I proved the rule that anytime you want to show something off, it's not going to work right. And since I was doing a studio tour and showing you how I put this whole thing together, it makes sense that I would screw it up and not have any audio for the first few minutes. But fortunately, it all went fine after that, and if you're interested in seeing that or any other replay, you can visit agencyleadership.tv, and that will give you a full archive of all of the videos that we have and all of the live stream replays. If you'd like some additional resources, you can go to agencyleadership.com/join. That takes you to the sign-up page for the Agency Leadership Council, which is free to join, gives you access to resources, workbooks, downloads, templates, and of course the private Slack community for agency leaders. So, if you have questions today, feel free to ask them in the chat on whatever platform you are currently watching on. If you want to submit questions in advance for next week's show or any future show, just use chip@agencyleadership.com if you want to send an email, or you can go to the Agency Leadership website and use the Ask Chip functionality at the bottom of every page. So, with that, let's go ahead and start diving into this week's questions. And so we'll start with this one here. How do you structure referral fees with other agencies? And this is a question that came up actually in the Spin Sucks Slack community, run by my Agency Leadership Podcast co-host, Gini Dietrich. I would encourage you to check it out and join if you're not already a member, but spinsucks.com will take you to her website, and spinsucks.com/spin-sucks-community will get you to the sign-up page for the Slack channel. So a great place, great conversation, and this is a question that came up earlier this week, and it really goes to the question of business development in partnership with other agencies. And so this is something that I know a lot of you think about from time to time as you look to grow the sales for your own agency, to generate new revenue, new business. And I could do a whole show just on this, and maybe I will at some point. We have done an episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast on that, so you can access the Agency Leadership Podcast archive on the website to find that. But for now, we're going to talk about the actual structure of the arrangements and not is it the right thing to do, because there are pros and cons to having referral fees. But if you're going to have referral fees, how should you structure them, and how much should they be? And I would say that, typically, I've seen everything from about 5 to 20% of the fees paid as being the referral fee. That's typically what you would see as a range. There are differences. Sometimes it's a flat number. If you're an agency that's selling a more productized service, that might be appropriate, where most people are paying the same amount, and so you might pay it that way. There are also differences in the percentages depending upon whether the agency that has referred the business is working with you on it, in which case I'm not generally a fan of referral fees in those cases, because you should just work out your fees correctly. Referral fees are really more if someone's just entirely handing the business off to you and not collaborating with you in any fashion. And so within that range, I personally like right around the 10% mark. I think that's the appropriate number if you're going to be having a referral fee program with an external partner. But you need to think about 10% of what? Is it 10% of the value of the contract? So if someone signs a year-long contract for $5,000 a month, So that's 60,000 annualized value. Are you paying a referral fee of $6,000? And if so, is it all at once? Do you pay as the client pays? There's a lot of details that you need to work through whenever you're setting up a referral fee program. So let's kind of go through those one by one. The first thing you need to think about is the timing of the payments. And in particular, is it that one-time thing up front? That's obviously the cleanest and easiest, but then what happens if the client breaks their contract or doesn't pay timely or those kinds of things? Then how do you handle those? And that's much more complicated with an external referral partner than it might be with an internal salesperson or an employee who's selling as part of their responsibility. So I'm not generally a fan of a lump sum upfront payment for external partners that is tied to an annualized value of a contract because I think it gets too messy. Instead, I prefer to see quarterly payments. I don't like monthly because that requires too much bookkeeping on the agency's part, and it sometimes will make those referral fee checks small enough that the other agency that's receiving them may not be that excited, right? Part of the reason why you're doing referral fees is to get the other party interested in and excited about sending business your way, and so that when you do that, you want to make sure that when they get that check, they're like, "Aha, this is great. I'm very appreciative of this." So breaking it into quarterly payments reduces your paperwork headache and also boosts the size of that check so that it's more impressive to your referral partner. The other thing that you want to think about timing is it based on just that client has remained, or is it based on what they've actually paid in that time frame? We all know that there are plenty of clients out there who do not pay in a timely fashion. And when I go in and I look at agencies' books, I often see invoices that are sitting in the 60 or 90 or 120 day plus categories of unpaid. And so if you're paying referral fees, ideally you want to be paying it based on what you have actually been paid by that client that was referred to you. That does require a little bit more math and paperwork on your part internally, but I think that you're unlikely to have so many referral partners and so many clients that have been referred that it becomes overly cumbersome, particularly if you're only doing this quarterly. So I would encourage you to do it based on amounts actually paid, and that then solves the other problem as far as what happens if the client breaks their contract and doesn't continue on for whatever the duration of it was supposed to be. And obviously we've seen a lot of that kind of activity this year in the midst of COVID as the economic disruption has caused agency clients to break their contracts, and there's really very little that you can do in those circumstances. So you want to make sure that you're accounting for those things and you're clearly communicating all of this up front to your referral partners. They know how much are they going to get paid, when are they going to get paid, what are the conditions for that payment. Now you have to look at, do you make these payments just forever, or is it just for the first year or two? And so, those are things that you need to really think through. Obviously, if you do it for the life of the contract, that's the most appealing to your referral partner. But it also means that you may be paying for quite a long time. And if they may have been active in making the initial referral, but are they still active in helping you to maintain a relationship with that client over time? If not, then 3 or 4 or 5 years later, and you're still writing them a check, you may start to resent that. So I like having some sort of a cap on the length of those payments, and I would say somewhere between 1 and 3 years is where I would cap the referral fee payment. And then that brings us finally back to the percentages. Again, my preference would be for something around 10%, but it does depend on how profitable your agency is, what kind of margins you're generating. It may depend upon the kinds of referral partners that you have. If they're bringing folks to you that are relatively easy to close and high profit, then you can afford to pay a higher percentage on that referral. Whereas if it's a very loose referral, and they're just, sort of passing someone along to you, but they're not helping you in any way in closing that sale, well, then you may want to be moving that percentage down a bit. to account for the extra work that you have to do. You really want to think of referral fees as part of your overall sales and marketing expenses, and so you want to think about what is it worth to you to acquire a new client. So don't look at these referral percentages in the abstract, but instead look at it in those terms. What does it take to acquire a client? What is your lifetime value for that client? What's your profit margins on those types of clients? And that will all help inform the best percentage to use for a referral fee. So make sure you get the details right, make sure you crunch the numbers on the math to make sure that it actually works for you, and think through the various contingencies that may come up and address those in advance so you're not scrambling to figure them out when something goes amiss later on. So it was a great discussion in the Spin Sucks community, and hopefully this has given you all listening some additional ammunition as you're thinking about the potential for referral fees as a way to generate business for your agency. Okay, so let's go ahead and we will move on to question number 2 that came into the mailbag this week. And as I said, if you've got your own questions, go ahead and share them live, and I'll be sure to answer them as we're going along here. But in the meantime, we will cover the ones that have come in advance. And so this was a longer question, and this may have come from the Spin Sucks community too. To be honest, I don't remember where I made note of it. But anyway, how do you fund your agency? Self-funded, revenue only, equity holders, lines of credit, other debt? I often find our growth is hampered by this issue. So as you are looking to grow your agency, you often want to make investments in sales and marketing, or some infrastructure around managing your team more effectively, or those kinds of things. And obviously to do that, you need capital to do it. So this question really goes to how do you fund that? And there are obviously cited here a number of different ways that you can raise funds in order to accelerate the growth of your agency. And I want to start by saying that in general, I believe that agencies should be growing organically. They should be taking advantage of the profits that they're generating and investing that in growth. So I'm not a huge believer in agencies taking on debt. I do think it's valuable to have a line of credit, but that line of credit really shouldn't be used for growth activities. It should be used to smooth over any payment issues. So if you're working with a larger client who, basically has the ability to bully small vendors like you and pay on a slowed down time frame, lines of credit can help you. You know you're going to get paid. It's a reliable payer, but they're slow paying, and so you can use the line of credit to smooth that out and make sure that you're paying your bills in a timely fashion, even as you're waiting for that. It's not ideal to be doing that on a regular basis, but having that line of credit can certainly give you peace of mind that you're not scrambling if you have someone who gets behind on their bills. But I don't want to see you carrying a line of credit that always has a balance in order to help you grow. That's not typically very effective. Certainly you wouldn't want to use credit card debt for that purpose. That's very expensive debt to use for it. Equity holders, there are times where agencies will take on equity investors. It is much less common than it would be in an actual product space where you're selling something physical or software as a service or something like that. But there are agencies who do have people who will invest in growing the business. You have to keep in mind that anytime you're talking about taking on an actual equity investor, that comes with strings attached. It's going to mean that you're not going to have the same level of control over your business, and you're not going to have the same flexibility to make decisions once you've taken on an investor or multiple investors in your agency, because their goal is going to be purely profit and purely on the side of, can you sell this someday so that my equity actually has real value to it? They're not investing typically out of the goodness of their heart and to let you do what you feel like doing. Whereas as an agency owner, if you're building organically, you can make decisions that suit you and your lifestyle over time. And so that may mean that there are periods where you want to pull back a little bit because you need to devote time to family or other things. There may be times where there are causes you want to become involved in, and you're willing to reduce your profit margin to take on certain projects that are important to you. If you've got equity investors, you now have pressure to maximize the return on investment. In fact, you have an obligation to them typically to return on their investment as much as possible, and so it makes some of those decisions more difficult. So I would certainly avoid debt. I would avoid equity investors if at all possible. Certainly stay away from really expensive debt like credit cards, and instead try to figure out how to reinvest in your own business. If you're feeling like you're being held back by that organic growth from the cash flow that you're generating, then what you may want to look at is whether or not your profit margins are where they should be. Because if you're throwing off enough cash in your agency business, you should be able to reinvest enough of that in growth that you shouldn't need to look outside for other funding sources. And if you are, that may be covering up other problems. Now, there's no one size fits all answer here, and so there may be reasons why your cash flow can't support that. But in general, I would say if your cash flow can't support growth, then that probably means there's something else you need to look at. Either your pricing is wrong, your cost base is wrong, or something else is not right with your business. So hopefully that gives you some ideas as to how you can find ways to grow your business and what you should look for as far as funding sources. Okay, let's move on to the next question here. And so this one is one that came in. Actually, this was one we didn't get to last week because there were too many questions in the mailbag, so I carried it over. And this one is, how do I expand beyond my own network to find new clients? And so this is, again, a typical challenge that many of you, I'm sure, are facing. You are working through your network. Everybody you know, your Rolodex. I guess we don't really call it a Rolodex anymore, although I do remember the days when I had the nice spinning Rolodex on my desk and it was just chock full of contacts. Now, of course, we've got LinkedIn and Facebook and Google Contacts and all that kind of stuff that we use instead, our CRM systems like Salesforce or Pipedrive, etc. And so we have these lists of people that we already know, and those are the folks that we tend to go to over and over again. And so at some point you are realizing that you need to go beyond that and not just talk to the same people that you're already focused on. Instead, you need to be looking for new people to bring into your network who are potential prospects, potential referral partners, or somehow can benefit your business. And many of you are, frankly, like me. You're not the outgoing type of person who naturally wants to just strike up conversations with new people. I sort of consider myself a shy extrovert. So once I get talking with someone, like I am with this camera right now, you can't stop me, right? I really enjoy it, but I'm shy in that I'm not going to walk around a cocktail party or something like that and go seek out new people. And so if you're like that, then it's helpful to find excuses to have conversations. So one of the things that I do is I use interviews for podcasts, live streams, articles, etc., as an excuse to reach out to someone that I'd like to begin to build a relationship with. And it allows me to do so on terms that they're more likely to accept, because I'm not reaching out and saying, hey, I'd like to sell you something, can I tell you about my services? And instead I'm saying, hey, I'd like to learn from you and I'd like to share that knowledge with other people. Are you interested? And the vast majority of people, in my experience, in all the podcasting and such that I've done over the last 15 years or so, I have had almost nobody say no to me if I asked for a conversation. Certainly some folks have been more difficult to schedule than others, but generally people will say yes. They're very open to having these conversations. And it's natural that if you're having those kinds of conversations with someone, that you'll have an opportunity before or after the formal interview, or perhaps both, to talk about what you do and learn more about what they do. And maybe you'll find some sort of opportunity to work together, or at the very least, you've created the beginnings of a relationship that you can then continue to cultivate by sharing information, by reaching out periodically just to touch base. So you've opened that door through these things. And so you want to try to find ways to expand your network by looking for those opportunities. But how do you find them? Well, one way would be using the Nifty 50 list that I encourage all of you to have, which is a list of 50 people that you want to get to know better that are potential clients or prospects or referral partners or vendors or those kinds of things. So people that you're trying to build that relationship with. So you start there. But you should also be asking the folks in your network for interesting people to talk to. Or, if you're looking for guests for a show, or if you're looking for someone to interview for some research you're doing, or for an article you're writing for a publication, or for your own blog, reach out to your existing network and say, hey, I'm looking for an agency owner who has young kids who'd be willing to talk to me for an article I'm writing about running an agency when you've got small children, particularly in the age of COVID, right? That's the kind of thing where you're giving a very specific ask to someone in your network to introduce you to someone outside the network. So that can be a really good way to start expanding it. So you've taken advantage of my first tactic suggestion, which is to create an excuse for that conversation. But now you've also been able to tap into your existing network to help you find those folks. So it's not just you going out and searching LinkedIn or going through lists of potential clients or those kinds of things. It's crowdsourcing effectively the outreach that you're doing. So that also helps you build those relationships even more deeply with folks in your network, because you're now reaching out to them with a concrete ask, but a friendly one, if you will. You're not asking for them to introduce you to someone who can buy your services directly. You're again asking for that informational contact, which people are more open to doing, and it also comes across as a win for them, typically because they're reaching out to someone that's not in your network but is in theirs, and creating an opportunity for that individual to promote themselves by participating in that interview. So there's a lot of these kinds of tactics that you can look at, and we could go on and on about the ways that you can expand your network, but hopefully this gives you one idea of something that you might do, even if building your network isn't your most comfortable thing to do each week. And then finally, I would just say you've got to be consistent about it. No matter what tactics you try to adopt, you want to make sure that you're doing them on a consistent basis, because that's where you begin to see results. One of the challenges that a lot of us have, myself included, I get a lot of ideas, I run in a million different directions, but it's really picking a few things, executing on them well, executing on them consistently, that will produce the best results, and not the shotgun approach where you're trying all sorts of different things all at once. Okay, so let's go ahead and we will jump on to the next question here. And this one is, what is the best time tracking tool? I get this question over and over and over again, but I will continue to answer it because it is important, and keeping track of time in an agency is not fun, it's not pleasant, it's not high on any of our lists to do, but it does matter because we're selling our time, and the only way to be able to accurately assess our profitability is if we know how much time we're investing in certain projects and clients. So I do encourage all of my clients to be doing time tracking, if not all the time, at least occasional snapshots so they're getting accurate data. And so then the question always becomes, well, what tools should I use? And I will tell you that there are a gajillion tools out there that will help you track time. You can also do it on pen and paper. You can also do it on a spreadsheet. There's no shortage of ways to do it. There is no single best way to do it. I would say to you a couple of things. If you're looking for a specific product recommendation, I use Harvest personally. I've used Harvest with my own agencies. I really like Harvest. It's simple, it's easy to use, it gives you the flexibility that you need as a manager, and it's also friendly from an employee standpoint. So that's generally my specific recommendation. I've used other ones as well. They all have their benefits. They all have their drawbacks. And so you need to try out a few to figure out what's going to work best for your agency and the way you're set up. And it depends upon how many layers of management you have, how much transparency you have between employees and the projects that they're working on. It comes down to what integrations it may have with other software that you're using. You can have some that will integrate with your accounting software, for example, which can make billing easier if you're doing any billable hour work. And even if you're not, it can help you generate profitability reports in your accounting software directly from the data that you're tracking in your time tracking. So there are all those things to think about. But ultimately what it comes down to is the best time tracking app is going to be whichever one you're using consistently. So it has to be something that you're comfortable using. You have to keep the setup simple enough that you're not asking employees to input more data more often than it's actually needed. And so you want to be thinking through very carefully. Most of these platforms will let you track 95 different categories for every single project. Is this an email? Is it a phone call? Is it a Zoom call? Is it a webinar? I mean, you can get super granular with how you track time, but the more granular you get, the more data that you're asking for, the less reliable that data becomes, and the more uncomfortable your team becomes in taking the time to do it. So you want to think that through very carefully, and make sure that you're setting up a system that is designed to succeed. So focus less on which software I would recommend or anyone else would recommend, and instead try it out, see how it works, make sure it's got the functionality that you're looking for. Define that functionality in advance, by the way. You don't really want to be doing this on the fly. If you're trying out software and then figuring out after the fact what you need, then you're going to be in a position where you tend to be looking at a wish list of items as opposed to what you really actually need in order to make sound, smart business decisions. So with that, hopefully that gives you some ammunition as you think about what time tracking software to use. And if you have specific questions about any other packages or how to set things up, I'm always happy to talk about those things because I'm kind of a data nerd and time tracking is part of that practice. So, all right, we got time, I think, for a couple more questions here. So let's jump ahead and we will go to this one. I have a prospective client that wants to pay me with equity in his startup. Is that a good idea? Wow. No, probably it's not a good idea. Very rarely do you come out ahead by taking equity in a startup in exchange for the services that your agency offers. It doesn't mean it can't happen. It doesn't even mean that I haven't done it before. I have. But if you're going to do it, you have to go in eyes open. You have to assume that you will never get paid for that work. You have to assume that that equity will never pay off for you. And it's difficult because typically when you're in this conversation with a prospective client, the prospective client is very bullish on what their prospects are. You're very bullish on them, otherwise you wouldn't want to be working with them. And so you're having this conversation in a time where both sides are very excited about what could happen. But if you're doing this and you're investing a lot of time and energy in it and it never pays off, are you okay with that? If the answer to that is yes, okay, then you can proceed with the conversation. Even then, you still have to look at this carefully because if you're going to take equity in a startup in exchange for the services that you're offering, there may be tax consequences. So you would never want to take equity in another business without carefully considering the tax and legal consequences and having conversations, ideally with professionals who understand your circumstances and who understand the implications of taking equity in a startup, and make sure that you understand what it's going to mean for your own personal situation. So you don't want to enter into this lightly. It's not something that you want to do out of the enthusiasm of the moment. And instead, you want to be very carefully thinking about what it really means. I can tell you that in most cases that I have seen this, it is done by a startup who doesn't have cash and is looking for a way to get services because they don't have cash. If that's the case, then you have to make sure that you're clear on why they don't have the cash. Is it because they're too early in the process and so they're not generating any cash yet? In which case, it's really speculative. Is it because they're having to invest everything into product development or sales and marketing outside of the activities of your agency? Well, that's good to know. If they're spending that money with other agencies or other marketing partners and not you, and they want you to take equity instead, what does that mean? You need to think that through. So the more that you would never want to take equity in a business without really understanding what their circumstances are and understanding the fundamentals of their business, because you are now becoming an investor. And effectively what you're doing is you're becoming an angel investor in that startup. So if you were thinking about writing a check to a startup for $10,000, $25,000, $50,000 or more, you would ask a lot of questions. You would want to know more about what they're doing, what their plan is. You would want to know how they're capitalized. You would want to know what their ownership structure is. These are all questions you need to ask if you're considering taking equity in exchange for your agency's services. And then again, you need to be comfortable with all of the money that you're spending as an agency on your staff's time, on other resources, that you will never see a return on that. And if you're comfortable with all of that, if that's a risk that you're willing to take, if you believe that this is a sound investment, then by all means go for it. As I said, I've done it before, and I'll probably do it again. And as someone who loves the entrepreneurial space, it makes sense for me to do that from time to time because it's the kind of risk that I take all the time. And it's the kind of thing I get excited about. But I never do it for a business that I'm not familiar with the fundamentals of that business myself. I always ask a lot of questions. It would always be something that I would consider investing in with actual cash anyway. And so if you're checking all those boxes, then it's worthwhile to consider. But I would say to you that most of you out there who come to me with this question are not in that position and you haven't thought those things through. So in general, I think if you're approached about trading equity for your services, my default answer would be no, and you would have to talk me out of it very effectively. All right, so let's go ahead, and I think we got time for one more question here before we go. So let's bring that one up on the screen. What are some of the biggest mistakes or failures you have had that you can learn lessons from? So I've never made any mistakes. I mean, that's why I do this show, right? Because I'm perfect. No. So I've given a lot of talks on failure over the years, and I've been on a couple of panels as I think about it about failure. There are no shortages of failures that I could talk about. And one of the reasons why I generally like talking about failure is because I think you learn more from failure than you do from success. Success can be dumb luck. Failures can be bad luck, but more often than not, you learn from those failures that there was something you could have done to either improve your luck, or there was something that you could have done to mitigate the risk, or somehow that you could have steered yourself onto a different path. Now, a lot of times it requires hindsight. And so you're not going to solve everything, and you're not going to prevent all future failures. But if you can learn from your failures and the failures of others, it can really help position you better for future success. So some failures that I've had, I would say probably one of the biggest ones is one that I've alluded to previously, which is not being consistent, going in too many different directions at once. That manifests itself for me in multiple ways. It manifests itself in just what I'm doing personally on a day-to-day basis. I tend to involve myself in too many different activities, both business-related and otherwise. I have a lot of interests. I like to explore a lot of interests. That's not always the best from a success perspective because I spread myself too thin at times. On the larger level, I spread myself too thin because I will often have multiple companies going at once. And when you're running multiple businesses at the same time, it's very difficult to get the maximum result out of each of them. And so one of the failures that I've had is the failure to say no to ideas that I have, ideas that people come to me with. And so I need to learn, and I continue to need to learn, to do a better job at fencing off my time and being realistic about what I can actually accomplish. And if I'm going to take on multiple things, I need to understand what the trade-off is. And if I'm going to have multiple businesses, I need to not only understand those trade-offs, but if I'm going to go down that path, then I need to make sure I understand who in those businesses is going to be responsible for the balls that I'm dropping. And I absolutely need to make sure that those are covered. So spreading myself too thin would be probably near the top of my biggest failures. I would say another one has been sticking with employees too long that I know aren't going to work. And I've often said on some of these shows that I enjoy firing people, and I do. I don't enjoy laying people off, and I don't enjoy letting people go who just are in over their heads. But if I've got someone who is not achieving their full potential for whatever reason, or is misbehaving is the wrong word, but not abiding by policies and rules and that kind of stuff, yes, I enjoy those. But I don't enjoy it when it's someone who's just not quite up to the task. And so in those cases, I am often very slow to let employees go. I'm also very slow because a lot of times I convince myself that I'm better off having someone in a role than nobody. And I can tell you from hard-won experience over the last 25 years, you're almost never better off by having an underperformer in a job slot than having nobody in that job slot. Because as long as you have that underperformer in place, you will continue to slow down the process of actually finding a replacement. Once that slot is vacant, you will work and try to move the stars and everything else in order to get someone in that place who is a good fit. So, and frankly, sticking with employees who are in over their heads or not a good fit or just not up to a job, that's not a service to that individual. It helps them in the short term, but it damages them in the long term because you're not helping them find what may be a better fit for them where they really can excel. And so that would certainly be one of my failings and something that I need to continue to learn from. So those are a couple of examples. Maybe we'll do a whole show on failure at some point because I could go on and on about all of the mistakes that I've made and continue to make. Just this week, I probably made a few if I think about it and reflect on it this weekend. Well, I didn't have the volume on the last episode, right? So there's a failure on my part. I need to, and actually, when I had Brad Ferris on one of these shows a few weeks ago, we were talking before the show, and I was sort of mentally going through the things that I needed to do, and he said, geez, you probably ought to have a checklist. And he was joking with me, but not joking, because I talk all the time about the importance of checklists, and I do believe in them. And so I ought to have a checklist for starting this show. Even though it's just me, but it's a pre-flight checklist for getting this show started would help make sure that I don't screw things up and don't forget to turn on the volume or things like that. So anyway, that's a whole bunch of failures. I'm sure I can come up with more. Do reflect on your own. Think of what lessons you can learn from them, because failure is only bad if you repeat the same mistakes over and over again and you don't learn anything from them. Otherwise, they are tremendous learning experiences that will help you achieve your future success. So hopefully there's been a lot of things today that will help you achieve your future success in whatever you are doing. We'll be back here next week on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Monday and Wednesday we'll have some topics. Haven't announced them yet, but that's what we do on Monday and Wednesday. And then on Friday of next week, it will be a special episode of the Q&A. I will have a guest joining me, so stay tuned for that announcement. And I'm going to try for some of these Friday sessions to have another voice in so we can have some additional perspectives on the answers to your questions. So if you have questions that you'd like me to address and my special guest to address next week, go ahead and email me, chip@agencyleadership.com, or use the Ask Chip functionality at the bottom of the Agency Leadership website. And of course, as I always say, go to agencyleadership.tv if you'd like to get the archive of previous shows. Make sure that you click the subscribe button so you get notified by YouTube every time we go live and you never miss a show. So thank you all for joining. Thank you for watching. Have a great weekend, and I will see you back here on Monday at noon Eastern.